Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the second Futureset Systemic Risk Masterclass, which is a mouthful, Insuring the Uninsurable. This is delivered to you by Lloyd's in partnership with both the CII, Chartered Institute, and indeed the LMA, the Lloyd's Market Association. By way of introduction, my name is Stephen Catlin. I'm Chairman and CEO of Convex, and have the great pleasure and honour of chairing today's masterclass, Insuring the Uninsurable. This is the second in a series of 6 systemic risk masterclasses from Futureset, Lloyd's new global platform and community dedicated to driving greater and societal economic resilience to the world's most challenging risks. The global Futureset platform has been developed in response to the large and complex challenges and impacts arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, and the urgent need to begin a new connected conversation with customers, insurers, and governments to tackle the challenges that these risks bring. I'm so delighted to be leading this discussion today. It's a very, very absolute and important subject. It's a challenge that we've not had to meet before as an industry, although we've thought long and hard about systemic risk in the past, but this is for real, and here we are. And I think what we need to do today is talk about what we can't do as an industry, but more importantly, talk about what we can do. It's a very interesting panel, and it's great for me to work from Vicky Carter, Brian Dupereau, Julian Noisy, and Neil Maidament, all of whom I've known for many years, and I know will contribute greatly to the conversation. And if they hold back, it will be the first, as far as I'm aware, of any one of them. So, chaps, go for it. I hope you really enjoy this session. I do think that when we talk about insurable and uninsurable risk, it kind of comes in 2 parts. Is that which is actually very difficult to insure because of the moral hazard, or the lack of understanding of the risk, or the lack of ability to define the risk. Doesn't happen very often, but it's there. And then, as is the case with the pandemic as we see it today, we have the challenge of that which we can insure, but we can't insure all of it. The whole principle of insurance, and indeed reinsurance, is the many pay for the few. Well, the trouble with the systemic risk is that many are paying for the many. And as such, our system doesn't work as well as it has done previously. Now, obviously pandemic comes into this category. Cyber does, systemically, potentially. And if you include within terrorism the cyber aspects of terrorism, it is also systemic as opposed to being local. Now, who knows about climate change? I mean, at the moment, I don't think we would describe climate change as being systemic, but who knows where we're going? And it's not inconceivable in 5 to 10 years' time to find ourselves with a systemic exposure arising from climate change. It brings into the question of, okay, what is our relationship is and should be with governments? Should we be entering into public-private relationships? Very difficult to do. I know that from my involvement in the Insurance Development Forum, that the concept of a public-private relationship is great. The reality is something quite different. I do think as an industry we need to be honest about what we can do and what we can't do, but we should also continue to be creative and innovative. And so really I want today that we're looking more at what we can do rather than what we can't do. Without further ado then, I'd like to get into the panel discussion. But I do have to cover off, I'm afraid, some learning objectives for today's session, which are available in full on the screen, and then run an audience poll. As to learning objectives, broadly, you should leave this masterclass with a greater understanding of the impacts of systemic risk, and critically, to have a clear idea of how you can prepare yourself and your firm with the right tools and techniques to respond effectively. At the end of this session, we hope that you will be inspired to implement change in your own organisation and across the industry as we work together to find sustainable insurance solutions to systemic and black swan risks. If you are tweeting or posting to LinkedIn today, please be sure to tag at Lloyd's of London using the hashtag Lloyd's Futureset. Right, now, just a few moments of your time to conduct the first of two audience polls we have. The first question, which will be coming up on your screen now, is the insurance industry doing enough to protect society against systemic risk? I'll say that again. Is the insurance industry doing enough to protect society against systemic risk? You have a scale of 1 to 5. 1, the industry must do more. 5, the industry is doing all it can. I'm now going to give you 30 seconds, if I may, to click to put your vote in. Thank you so much. I will wait with interest to see what you have to say. Right, as we watch the final results coming in, I'm sure you can see them on your screen, I hope so. It's clear that many people on this call think we should do more. Very much fewer people thinking we can do all we can, and there's others in the middle. But it's interesting that 1 and 5 has both the highest and the lowest vote, which I think tells you that actually we in the industry are concerned about the issues and are wondering what we can do more to improve the lot of our customers, which is quite honestly what I would hope to have seen. So thank you very much for participating in that vote. And now to the next question, if I may. To what extent are systemic risks insurable? I repeat, to what extent are systemic risks insurable? Again, you have a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being completely uninsurable, 5 being fully insurable. So I'll now give you 60 seconds to click away at your heart's content. Thank you. Well, as the, excuse me, as the final results come in, it's interesting, isn't it? We find that more people than not think it is completely uninsurable systemic risk, and very few people think it's very fully insurable. And in fact, the range is a little bit tighter than the first question. So whether that's going to affect what our panelists talk about, time will tell. But without further ado, I want to move on to hear what our panelists have to say. Frankly, none of them need any introduction really, but just very quickly, Vicky Carter, Chairman of Global Capital Solutions. She probably doesn't want to be reminded of this any more than Brian and I do, because we're worse, has worked in the Lloyd's market for over 40 years as a reinsurance broker. She joined Guy Carpenter in 2010. She's also a company executive and also on the member of the Council of Lloyd's. Brian Duper certainly needs no introduction. Probably the greatest historian of the insurance industry ever. He's done more than any of us can even think about. Being successful both in leading broking houses and indeed carriers, and that's no mean feat to achieve that. Well done, Brian. I've regarded Brian as being one of my mentors for many, many years. He's a great friend and very wise counsel. And Brian, I know you're busy. Thank you for joining. Third panelist is Julian Noisy. I know Julian because for my sins, I'm actually, I chair his advisory council for Paul Re. Julian has been going through a fairly torrid time recently. I think you'll attest to that. And the relationship between Paul Re, the market and the government as I think will evolve in this conversation, can be quite testing. And I can tell you that Julian's got really first-hand knowledge of how testing it can be. Then lastly, our fourth panelist, Neil Maderman, described to me as an industry veteran. Well done, Neil. He's a member of the Council of Lloyd's, worked at Lloyd's Market for 34 years, was with Beazley, Chief Underwriting Officer, and active underwriter from 2008 through the next 10 years. He's also been chairman of the LMA, Lloyd's Market Association, which is a great piece of service, including now being a working member of the Council of Lloyd's. Welcome to all of you, Vicky, Brian, Julian and Neil. I've got a few questions to go through, but I mean, frankly, this should be free for all, and please feel free to interject whenever you so feel. The first question was a general question, really. Clearly, finding sustainable insurance solutions to systemic risk presents many challenges. In your view, panelists, what are the challenges today? What do you think we cannot do? But more importantly, what do you think that we can do? And Brian, maybe you could start off with this one.
Well, thanks, Stephen. You know, when I agreed to do this panel, you know, the topic was insuring the uninsurable. I said, well, this is going to be the shortest discussion on record, you know, because it isn't. and then the question, you know, started talking about systemic risk, and I thought, well, what is systemic risk? And I'm still not quite sure I understand the definition. You know, AIG was considered a systemic risk, and for good reason. We were a SIFI, you know, up until 2017. You know, to me, systemic in that context was always that, you know, there was a bad actor or two in the system and could take the system down by their misbehaviors, let's say, right? So there's a systemic risk, the house of cards kind of an analogy. I don't think we're talking about that here. I think we're talking about a risk that could take the system down. And you know, you got to recognize we don't generate risks, we take them on, and therefore it would be a risk that we take on that could theoretically take down the entire system. Well, if you could take down the whole system, you probably should call it uninsurable, right? Because you don't want to be taking risks down that could take everything down with it. And you know, generally speaking, we have not had that. I mean, there are certain things that have historically not been insurable, like war. You know, I was around when, you know, the 9/11 response was pretty severe. You know, we as an industry, particularly the U.S., but I think globally, said this is uninsurable. And, you know, if it's uninsurable, it's uninsurable. And I think we've got to be careful about what we then tell the society we can do. You know, we cannot put ourselves forward as the solution to all risk problems. And I think we, you know, sometimes we advertise that and give the wrong impression. So what can we do and what can't we do? Look, I think we certainly can't insure what you can't insure, right? You just can't, okay? So what do we, let's use the terrorism, and I'll stop talking when that came about. What we said was we cannot figure out frequency or severity. We don't know how many of these are going to occur. We don't know how big they're going to be. You know, is it, you know, this is man-made. There's no data. What we can do is maybe create a box and say within that box we can do something. So if you can cap, you know, north and south, east and west frequency, severity, if you can cap that for us, we can play in the middle and provide some form of risk transfer within reason, but we cannot take it all on. We can take a little bit on, and the rest is left to society. So I think there are some treatments around that. I mean, COVID is even worse than the, you know, terrorism risk at the time. I mean, it just incomprehensibly large. And there, I fear that even saying the word insure and COVID is a misrepresentation. So I think we just have to be very, very careful about what we say to society we can do, and then what responses we can make. I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk about mitigation and risk prevention and using, our vehicle, our tools to help society. But maybe I'll stop talking because I'm sure there's others who have a different point of view or not. So let me stop, Stephen, and I'll come back on.
Oh, Brian, thank you for that. I mean, I do particularly agree with what you say about us being clear about what we can and cannot do. And I fear there's been a bit of obfuscation over the last 12 months from the industry, which I don't think has been helpful. But anyway, more of that from other people. Vicky, your turn. Give it a go.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. I agree with Brian. I think the big question is, do we really truly understand systemic risk? The industry has a strong track record of helping businesses of all sizes mitigate critical risks, including natural catastrophes, workplace hazards, cyber threats, and more. And, mitigation comes in multiple forms, which, as you've just alluded to, we'll probably get into in more detail. But it's not just insurance policies. It's investing in research and models to understand and quantify risk, and also educate customers and society on what risk really is. And if you look at systemic risk and you start to look at what are the forces that really can drive systemic risk, and do we really understand those? So demography is a classic example. The world population will increase to 9 billion by 2050. That's a huge, sudden growth, and those tend to all occur around, concentrations in cities to create mega cities, which means that, people and assets become more susceptible to larger risks. You've got age structures. A third of the population in developed countries will be over 60 by 2050. And there's huge migrations from the south to the north. And, that's obviously from areas of poverty or causes like we're seeing with war, natural disasters in certain parts of the world. And that can aggravate risks, particularly things like infectious disease. You've obviously got climate change and the impact of gas emissions. You've got another major factor is water scarcity. So 2/3 of the population will live in water shortages by 2050. I mean, that's a huge number. And then things like the reduction in biodiversity, deforestation, and what that's going to do. And technology, the speed at which technology is growing and the threats that brings in cyber risk. So it's a massively complex subject, and one that I'm not sure we all fully understand, which opens up, obviously, threats to us all. So we can talk about risk mitigation later, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the solutions. But like Brian, I'll let the others have their say now too.
Thank you, Vicky. I think, again, highlights that how much do you really understand about what we're talking about? I think probably the answer to that one is not enough. Julian, your turn.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'm sort of sitting here chuckling to myself as you say that we don't understand it enough. As somebody who, of course, as part of the CBON coverage within Paul Reed, covers a pandemic were it to be caused by a terrorist. And of course, that leads into the whole issue of unlimited guarantee and all those kind of things that you and I have discussed. So, I think it's very interesting looking at that poll where you had the vast majority of the attendees on this saying that it was completely uninsurable. And I think I would just make the point that what is completely uninsurable changes over time. So Brian alluded to 9/11. I know, for example, you, after 9/11, did still insure terrorism, but I think you were in a minority of one, perhaps. But today, I think terrorism would be viewed very, very differently. I think there are probably almost too much risk sitting in within national pools because of the way they're structured, whereas actually much of that risk is now insurable and indeed reinsurable. So I think what's uninsurable changes over time. And so I guess the point that I would make is that the choice that we're faced with as an industry today is whether we just walk away from this and say it's too big, it's, there's more being paid out by national governments than there is even market cap or capacity within the insurance industry, or whether we try and identify a way in which we can play a part. And everybody's alluded to risk mitigation, etc. So I'll come back to that. But we as an industry have an economy of scale. And one of the great things about pooling arrangements, whether it's TRIA in the States or us over here, is that you have an economy of scale created, which can be used to invest in an understanding of the model and using the things that the industry does well, not just risk financing, but risk management. And those are the things that I would want to go on and talk about, as long as we can protect shareholders from the adverse risks that come with that.
So, Neil, now that you're relieved of your underwriting responsibilities in terms of liability, you can be a bit more dispassionate, I guess. So how do you view life now?
Well, I think when I was thinking about systemic risks, I was thinking of events that are multi-regional or perhaps global, which, as you and Brian and others have pointed out, presents this accumulation challenge, which is really difficult for the industry, which normally depends on spread of risk. So I would say that the key challenge in that context is that the industry has a finite amount of capital. And when it thinks about pandemic or terrorism or space weather or cyber events that might be created by the covert action of nation states or the failure of a web service provider, those type of events, they could exceed the industry's resources. But I'm not sure that the fact that those types of systemic events are greater than the industry's capacity necessarily means it doesn't have a role to play. So, you know, if I was trying to answer the question of what can the industry do, I think I'd start with the fact that we have expertise. So we should use that technical capacity, as we've done, as Julian just said, in the field of terrorism, to develop, price and manage the aggregation of products. And then, as you mentioned in your introduction, I think we also have a delivery system to distribute those policies and to pay claims. So we don't have the capacity to deal with these issues on our own, but I think we are ideally placed to coordinate the response.
Thank you.
Could I, Stephen, can I jump in for a second?
Sure.
Because it's something that that Julian said that triggered something, and that is, you know, this, you were out there writing terrorism, and I think there was a number of people who were, there were a number of people who were writing terrorism. We have war risk, uninsurable. Lloyd's makes a living on war, with certain syndicates do. But there's a difference to me between voluntarily taking a risk on and having it mandated. And I think that's something we've got to also put on the table here. When terrorism was, when that 9/11 struck, we had certain coverages that we had to cover terrorism in. So for instance, property coverage. If there was a fire, regardless of the cause, you covered it. Workers' compensation in the US, it's covering everything. And so what we were presenting was to the government of the US in this case was the fact that there isn't a free market situation here. You're making us do this. We cannot do it. And I think we should distinguish. You look at, if an individual company wants to take on COVID and put a COVID policy out, nobody stops them. Maybe the regulator should stop them because it's not prudential. But we've kind of prided ourselves on being able to take on risk, right? Innovation and all of that. But I do think we should recognize that there are certain things that shouldn't be forced upon us. And that's, that the dialogue around COVID is it being forced upon us, even though we didn't think we covered it. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, Brian, sort of sticking with you, if I may, taking on board what Neil said about we have finite capital, which is absolutely true. And I think we have to remind ourselves and those around us of that point, actually, but that is about the ability to pay and how much. In honesty, Brian, as you look at today's society and the clear increasing nature and quantum of systemic risk, which I think you said yourself is something I'm not sure all of us understand, and I think everybody would agree with you on that. How do you think we're doing in terms of the customer, in terms of meeting his need under these circumstances? Are we doing enough? Are we doing too much? Are we confusing? Are we helping or are we hindering? What's going on?
Well, I said earlier, I think sometimes we do, say things that may be a bit extreme in terms of our ability to cover things. And, we have this great debate over the many years I've been in the business about simplicity of contract wording. And then, well, we don't do this and we don't do this and we don't do this. We got a litany of exclusions. And what's the right situation here? Because if the contract's so simple, it says we cover everything, well, that doesn't work. And so there has to be some, way of describing what we do and what we don't. And the risks that we take on are so complicated and complex that I think I'm not sure you could ever solve this problem. It's the Gordian knot kind of thing. I don't think you can ever untie it. And I think the question of are we doing too much or too little, we kind of put ourselves out as the solver of all problems, and sometimes that's an issue. So let's take cyber. I mean, cyber, we've covered it. It is, people say what keeps me up at night when I was doing my town halls first coming to AIG, it was cyber, other than my kids. And, it is a risk that is evolving as we speak. The R&D of the bad guys is better than our R&D. And, every time you think you've got it, you don't. And it's a very difficult risk. And so I think, our ability to take it on in some way, shape, or form probably has been exhausted. And so the capital that we can deploy as an industry, remember, the capital we have covers a lot of different things. We have our models where you get benefits for diversification. Well, diversification means there's a whole bunch of different risks in that pot. Each one needs to be fed, and you can't just say, well, I've got this, whatever size balance sheet and expect that that's completely usable for the new risk. It's been taken, it's been set aside already, right? So you got to be careful about that. And that brings me to a thought about, using the broader capital market, which I think has been something to some degree we feared for many years because there goes our business. But on the other hand, there are just certain things that we need to spread using our techniques and abilities, but not our balance sheet, much like the managing agent in a Lloyd's is spreading that risk around to those who want to take it. And I think developing techniques around that probably is a better way to go than to claim we can do it ourselves.
Thank you. Neil, as you look at this challenge, how do you think the industry is doing and what can it do better?
I think as Vicky said and as Brian said, there are lots of risks that we are doing a pretty good job on. They tend quite often to be the tangible risks. I think the industry has got a pretty good handle on how to cover tangible risks, and the challenge probably in front of us is that balance sheets are increasingly about intangible risks, and Brian was just eloquently talking about the challenge of cyber as one example. So I think if the industry wants to maintain its relevance, it will need to lean into some of these issues. And if I could just add one thought to Brian's point about wordings, I agree that problem is a bit like a Gordian knot in the sense it's a very difficult problem to fix. But I would also say that the kind of post-event widespread wordings challenges that we've seen in response to the pandemic erode trust in the industry, and our product is a promise to pay, And so I think, although it is a very complicated challenge, we do need to get better or to work harder at the design and explanation of how our products operate.
Okay, thank you. Julian, you are one of a reasonable few number of people that are first-hand experienced in public-private relationships, being the CEO of Pool Re and having a relationship with your carriers, who are also your pool members, and also a relationship with the government. And I know you've had your trials and tribulations firsthand for some time now. I mean, I'd like you to explore, as far as you feel able, what you've learned in the last 2 or 3 years in particular, and indeed all the time you've been CEO of Pool Re. But Pool Re has changed a lot in terms of what its purpose is today from what it was when you first joined.
Thank you, Steve. That's quite a big question, and I guess just to sort of start with the question you originally answered and then lead into that, I think, Neil mentioned trust and confidence of the customer. I think that's absolutely right, and certainly if you look at government's perspective of our industry at the moment, it is, and indeed the court of public opinion, it is an industry that sort of looks not to pay when there's a problem. Rightly or wrongly, and I'm not suggesting I believe that that's the case, but that is the opinion that they have on us. And so I think, to answer the specific question, again, using Neil's turn of phrase of leaning into the problem, I think our goal has been to do 2 things. One is to wind Pool Re up and make it and render it no longer necessary because the market can take back the risk. And in order to do that, we've had to invest money. And when I say money, I mean premiums collected from insurers, invested into understanding a risk, which, as I said earlier, 28 years ago was viewed as being uninsurable, to turning it into a risk which today the market, both reinsurance, insurance, and capital markets all take a much bigger share of. And then to try and redesign the system so that only the tail portion of the risk, whether we call that systemic, whether we call it difficult to insure, whether we call it uninsurable in the case of nuclear, are all debates that we've been having. But how do you remodel something into something that does only the bit that the insurance industry can't do? And I call that an economy of scale from the industry that invests in R&D, which I think is one of the things that's missing from our industry, is we're not investing in understanding new perils and designing products for those new perils.
Does anybody want to make any observations of what Julian's doing at Pool Re or the challenges he's got in front of him, or shall we move on? They're letting you off the hook, mate. I can't believe that. Vicky, as you think about systemic risk, being a reinsurance guru, I mean, do you see that the role of the reinsurance market be the same as, or different to that of the insurance model? And how do the two fit together? I mean, we've particularly seen it as we look at pandemic, and I think we all recognise that the event definition is going to be a complete and utter nightmare to handle. And I can see us doing huge reputational damage to each other as we fight in the courts about what an event is or isn't. So as you look at this as the benefit of history and recent hindsight, how do you view life?
I just think one of the biggest challenges we face as an industry is the ambiguity we've created around wordings. And I think we need to provide so much more clarity, particularly to our customers. They need to really understand what they're being covered for and what they're not being covered for. And I think, there are ways that we can go about helping our customers, whether it's, insurers or reinsurers, through risk mitigation. There's a huge amount of things we can do about that. Early warning identification of vulnerability, things like that. But I think all those type of things need international cooperation, particularly in, sort of developing economies where they maybe don't have such sophisticated systems. And one of the most important things, I think, is the transfer of knowledge, skills and data and technology to help us close the gaps. So whether that comes down to creating, new sorts of models, and if you look at things like cyber, there are a number of new sort of models out there to model cyber, and so I think that those are all things that are developing fast. I mean, my experience has been interesting with the work we're doing at Lloyd's around Restart, which is, a pandemic product which we are looking to sell out to the SME and the micro SME market in the UK. And I know, Stephen, you've been involved in some of those activities as well. And I think the challenge we have there is around, first of all, producing a product which is absolutely clear to the customer at a price which they can afford. And this can be, companies or businesses that have been very heavily hit financially by COVID, for example. And then a product which has enough rate in it for underwriters to take it on. So I think you've got a really delicate balance there. But I am hopeful through, the work we're getting, the science, the information we're getting. In particular, we're working closely with Oliver Wyman's Pandemic Navigator, which has huge amounts of data. They're advising the government with their data, that we will be in a position to be able to provide a product out mid-year, subject to things not deteriorating, and the continuation of the rollout of the vaccine, which is going so well in this country. And I think that will be an interesting test case. And I think things like parametrics will be one way of trying to provide some sort of cover in areas where this is just too big for the industry to sustain. If you turned around every contract that customers could claim against every policy they have, there's no way the industry would sustain it. And if you look at true systemic risk, that's probably going to be the challenge in the future. So the importance of having a public-private partnerships are going to become absolutely critical to manage systemic risk and to be able to manage the volatility of it and make it acceptable for the insurance industry.
Thank you. I have been the true broker. You gave a very eloquent answer without actually answering the question.
I'm so sorry, Steve.
So let me try again. I'm interested in your view as to the different role that there may or may not be between the insurance market and the reinsurance market.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think, it comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. I think, the insurance is dealing with the retail side, customers outside, and that's more about an understanding of products that are actually going to meet the needs that they require. I think with reinsurance, there's always a role for reinsurance sitting behind that to help, manage the volatility of that. And that will come down again to appetite and to the information that we can develop through models and restrictions put on, particularly if you look at Lloyd's with the new RDS scenarios they brought in. But it's interesting because if you think about systemic risk, it violates the fundamental insurance principle of diversification. So that creates its own challenge from a capital perspective. So I'm not sure if I've answered the question directly again, but I think, there are going to be challenges on both sides, Stephen, but I think one of the most important things is ensuring that whatever we sell to the customers is products that they require and they fully understand what they have cover for.
Thank you, Vicky. I think the comment there that struck me was the challenge of systemic risk, which is different to any other insurance risk, actually, and therefore our ability to cope with it has to be different. There's no doubt about that in my mind. I'd like to come back to that in a minute, actually, but we're going to run out of time. I always knew we were going to do this. A number of you talked about risk management, risk transfer, risk aggregation, risk mitigation. Brian, starting with you, when you look at where we are today as an industry, we all say we're good at this stuff, and I think we are good at it, actually, in many ways, and I think we're often a lot better at it than some of the industries we actually insure. But where do you think we're doing well, or where do you think we could do better in terms of this whole issue around risk management, sustainability, all that stuff? I mean, what's good, what's bad? You're on mute. Brian, you're on mute.
So what I was saying is, you're probably going to accuse me of what you accused Vicky of, because I'll try to answer this question. You may not like the answer. So look, I think in general we have evolved quite well as an industry in our modeling and analysis, and so maybe I give us better than passing grades there. I think there's, where we're falling short, I think, is on predictive as opposed to kind of using the past as the indicator, because I think things are changing so rapidly that you can get a false reading if you think the past is going to predict the future. So I think predictive analytics is something we're probably way behind on. We do modeling where we've got physical risk pretty well, but we don't model the human risk too well. So liability lines, you name it. I mean, or COVID. We don't have good models there. So I think we can do a lot better in absorbing, innovations in data science in terms of predictive analytics that we haven't done as an industry. So I'd say I pass us on one, but I think we haven't been doing enough. Look, we're very good at mitigation ourselves and the understanding of it and risk management. I think we can put ourselves forward as those who understand resiliency pretty well. You started the IDF, and that's very much involved in helping governments, particularly smaller ones around the world, understanding what they have, how they can mitigate it, and how they can come back from it. And I think we're beginning to have our proper place on the stage, discussing both those things on a global scale. So we're beginning, but we can certainly do a lot more. Back to my, I think risk transfer questions. I don't think we've done enough, but we're beginning to look at how we can bring in other capital into the play. Vicky mentioned parametrics, things like that. There's been some, we've started that. I think that's good. There's so much more to do. So maybe I'll stop at those.
Okay, thank you. Neil, what's your view of you mentioned yourself, you think we're quite good at it. So what are we doing well? What can we do better when it comes to risk mitigation, risk management, risk education, et al.?
Well, just to build on something that Brian was just saying there, I think we can do better at horizon scanning. So particularly for risks that are not the main drivers of our day-to-day business, and I think I would have put pandemic, and some of the other extreme risks that we've been talking about into that category. And in an ideal world, we'd be doing much more to plan and think through how those scenarios would unfold before they occur. The second thing I probably would point to that we could do better at is innovation. And I don't mean that we're not doing innovation. I mean, companies like AIG and markets like Lloyd's have a proud record of innovation. But as Vicky was just saying, I think it's very hard to innovate at scale. And one of the challenges is that it requires collaboration to pull together meaningful capacity and in order to distribute those products so if they're going to be successful. So I think we could do better at innovation. And then I think the third thing, and I'd be very interested in your comment on this, is that I think where we're looking for public-private partnerships, we could be clearer when we speak to government. Too often, probably, we struggle to present a unified view of what the industry needs. And I think Brian touched on that when he was describing how he helped lead the industry's response following WTC. We need to define the box within which we can operate.
Thank you. I'd like to expand on that, if I may, actually, because and I want to deal with, I guess, what is the real elephant in the room, which is at what point does something become uninsurable simply because of its quantity? I think we'd all agree that pandemic is not fully insurable, but it's so much greater than the total market cap of the P&C business in the world, which is, what should we say, north of $1,000 billion. The pandemic is far in excess of that. We know that. So in terms of being honest with governments and honest with ourselves, how do we actually deal with this really difficult issue that some of these losses are just too big for the industry to respond to? Yet at the same time, I think it's clear from what all of you said, we all want to play our part in trying to mitigate these risks. But how do we deal with this, the problem that we've never faced before until this year? How do we actually deal with a systemic risk which is far bigger than our industry's ability to pay? And how do we actually find a way of getting a transparent, workable cut-off? I mean, I can tell you from the work that we've done in the Pan-Re steering group, and Julian's been part of this, I mean, defining a pandemic is difficult enough legally. When you try and define the event definition, it's well nigh impossible. We've had some of the leading UK experts on this subject trying to get there, and they can't get there. So we can't sort ourselves out, let's be honest. We've got governments around the world who are at the moment concentrating on the here and now, because they have to. No criticism meant at all. That's what they need to do. But we fairly quickly, once we get through, maybe say middle of this year, to start thinking about the future. We need to work with governments and with each other to try and find some better, more pragmatic solutions than we have today. So how do we get there? What do we do? Vicky, you go on first. That's an easy question.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, I think prevention's got to be one part of it, which is an important part to play in helping to mitigate, how large that systemic risk is potentially going to be. And I think one of the things that maybe we're not great at as an industry is sharing knowledge. And I think, if you think about COVID, how we've come sort of through COVID, it's been bringing in, information and intelligence from virologists, epidemiologists, all these other types of talent in to find a way through to come out of the pandemic. And I know that ends up being a medical, the vaccination is a way out. But I think sharing information outside our industry and possibly bringing in new skill sets, and we haven't touched on skill sets in the future, and potentially they should be very, very different to maybe the skill sets we currently have in the industry. Maybe one way that we can look at how we better deal in the future with pandemic risk. But whether we will ever be able to provide a solution to cover the entire risk, or whether we have to be more honest about carving out what we believe we can cover and the parts that we can't, and maybe that's where we've got to then work with the banks and work with government for these partnerships, which I think are going to be, and I think we all agree, are critical to providing protection to any future systemic risk.
So, Julian, I mean, you've been right in the midst of these debates around terrorism, cyber terrorism, and what industry can pay and what it can't pay, and how relationships can and can't work with governments, particularly from your point of view, the UK government. You got first-hand experience of how difficult this is. What do you think we should do differently, not just around Paul Re, but around the whole issue of systemic risk? And how do we describe it? How do we define it? And what type of relationship should we have, if any, with governments around the world? Because at the end of the day, these really big systemic risks are owned by governments, whether they like it or not. It's their risk. And when they say, well, we don't want to have an unlimited liability in our balance sheet, my reaction is, well, tough, mate, you've got it. It's there. So, Julian, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, you're absolutely right. I think part of the challenge is to get government not to acknowledge, not to accept, because I think they do know that they've got it, but it's to actually acknowledge that they have got that risk. And therefore, all of the things that Vicky says to me come down to the design of the public-private partnership. Is it going to be pre-funded or post-funded? Is it going to have a sub-limited guarantee, or is it going to have an unlimited guarantee? Is it going to be sufficiently flexible to evolve its cover over time as we learn more? And is it going to be sufficiently flexible to push more risk back into the private market as the private market becomes more accepting of that risk? So it's the design of the private partnership. But what a PPP does is it allows you a cloak where you don't have to worry about competition rules, and you can collaborate, to use Neil's word. How do you figure out you've got to be able to collaborate. You've got to have that economy of scale that I referred to earlier, where the premium is coming in. And obviously the majority of it is there to distance government and the taxpayer from the loss. But given the size of these losses that we're talking about, however much premium you're going to connect, it's going to be a drop in the bucket. So why wouldn't you use that for the modelling and the risk mitigation and the risk management that Vicky was talking about? And then lastly, you asked about the insurance and the reinsurance industries. I think part of the beauty of a public-private partnership is it provides the glue between both, allowing both to play the optimal sharing of risk, so that they take on as much of that risk as is possible, due to all of the work that the public-private partnership has done. But as you know, Stephen, we've got a government here and around the world that is completely overwhelmed with the current situation. And I think it's the industry must continue, as you've done, to play its part and to show them that we're here and ready to talk to when they're ready, but that there is a limit to what we can do. And that on day one will be very little, and on year 10 it might be a little bit more than it is now. And it's whether they want to go on that journey or whether they just want to carry the whole risk, which I think would be wrong, because ultimately it's not them that's carrying it, it's the taxpayer. So I think it's incumbent on us to do something.
Thank you. Let's do a quick round the table. Any thoughts, Marie, as we draw this part of the meeting to a close? We're going to do a couple more questions in a moment, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A to the audience. But any observations from you guys whilst we've got a captive audience? Might not last for much longer.
Yeah, let me just jump in, Stephen. And it is this question of our response, our responsibility. I mean, we want to be good, citizens of the world and do our bit and everything. But my concern is in these discussions around COVID response, we're walking this political tightrope of it's uninsurable, but we're here to help kind of thing. And sometimes, the uninsurable gets lost in our, desire to, not bring down, the political wrath on the industry. And I do think we just, our process of education, maybe it's a public private partnership approach that Julian mentioned, gives us the ability to do that. But I worry about, getting, working ourselves into solutions which cause us great risk, great harm, because if it's uninsurable, it's uninsurable, and to the extent you've got something out there that begins to say it is, then, I'm not sure that you can, put that genie back in the bottle.
Thank you, Brian. Neil, any further comments from you?
No, I think I would just echo what Brian had said. I think, and going back to his example of what happened after those tragic events, the WTC attack, the industry responded by developing a specific product where it could define the role that it could play for customers who had lost coverage going forward. And that was empowered by public-private partnerships that were clear about the edge of what the industry could do. So I think that is how I would respond to Brian's challenge of how do we walk that tightrope between being too keen and also aiming to remain prudent. I think we need to be clear, whether it's cyber or any of these other risks, what part of that risk we believe is insurable.
Thank you. Vicky, any further thoughts from you?
Just really, I mean, insurers are the receivers of systemic risk, and we're not really the creators of it, are we? I mean, you know, I think that it's a great shame that our reputation has been damaged by, you know, some of the events of COVID and the BI issues and challenges through, you know, ambiguity of wordings, which it comes back to. But, you know, we are trying, you know, a number of us are trying, you know, we're looking at various ways that we can create some products. But if you look at things like cyber, which is, you know, potentially such a huge issue, you know, maybe that's something that, again, the government should sponsor, and maybe there needs to be government or federal cyber insurance program like they do with terrorism. So I think, you know, as we've all agreed, you know, some things are just too big for the industry to handle on its own. And it comes down to, you know, creating these partnerships for the future.
Thank you, Vicky. Julian, anything from you quickly?
Yeah, just one last point, I guess, is that obviously there's going to be a lot more of these risks in the future. And as Brian said earlier, you know, he sort of alluded to after 9/11, we were almost mandated to take the risk. And I think, you know, I think part of the challenge here is there's going to be more and more of these, is whether or not we can, you know, design it, because somebody has to pay for this. It's either going to be a levy on the industry or it's going to be a tax on the consumer. So again, I just lean towards the, you know, better opt-in than be forced in, I guess.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed for your participation, chaps. I mean, we've run out of time for this part of the meeting. We've now got a couple of questions to ask the audience, which I'll do in a moment. As I knew, we ran out of time. We could talk about this for hours. The one thing that we didn't talk about, which I think maybe we can in the Q&A session in some shape or form, is to what extent you think we should pull systemic risks together. So should you have an overriding relationship with the government for all systemic risks, which include cyber, terrorism, pandemic, maybe even climate in time to come. And I think that is the one bit we didn't get to. I'm sorry about that, but thank you very much for your participation. So, and please hang on, because you're going to ask, I hope, a lot of very difficult searching questions, far more difficult than the ones I asked you. So the first question for this second audience poll is, what role can the insurance industry play in helping to protect society against systemic risk? Let me say that again. What role can the insurance industry play in helping to protect society against systemic risk? Well, as we watch the final answers coming in, I think it's interesting, isn't it? There's an overwhelming majority of the people listening that thinks we should be working and partnering and collaborating with governments, which I think is a good message to send to governments, and thank you for that. There's also a very small minority of people who think that insurance has no role at all. So we clearly feel that we can do something, albeit not everything. And I think that's a valuable contribution from the audience, and thank you very much indeed. Now here's the second question. What are the skills and capabilities that we need to improve as an industry to protect society against systemic risks? And you're allowed to select two. What are the skills and capabilities that we need to improve as an industry to protect society against systemic risk, such as specialized risk knowledge, core insurance, technical competence, legal, regulatory, policy wordings, etc., collaboration and risk partnering, product and service design, innovation and entrepreneurship, data and analytical skills. So off we go. Thank you. Well, as we watch these results come in, it's interesting, isn't it? Half of the audience believes we need to improve data analytical skills. That sounds reasonable. It's interesting, though, if you look at, there's a cluster there of collaboration, risk partnering, specialized risk knowledge, innovation, entrepreneurship, technical competence, are roughly together, technical competence lower, and interesting, very few people think there's much to do with product and service design. So that was really meant to be just a straw poll as to how people think. And I hope that you have found the 4 questions interesting, and indeed the answers that come therefrom interesting. So now it's a bit you've all been waiting for, where we move on for Q&A to the audience. So please don't be shy. Enter your questions under Q&A, and Rebecca is going to pick up the ones that are most frequently asked, and we'll answer as many as we can. So thank you so much for listening, and over to you.
Even I think the questions are actually in the chat that Rebecca's put there for you to direct to the participants, if you can see the chat.
Yep, I've got them, I think. So the first question, if we're always playing catch up with our understanding of risk, e.g. terrorism and cyber, how do we deal with the reputational risk that comes with what's covered and what's not covered? Good question. And I think we understand the question and the need for lack of ambiguity. Easier said than done. Neil, you have the first crack at that one.
Apologies, could you just repeat the question? Sorry, Steve.
If we are always playing catch up with our understanding of risk, e.g. terrorism and cyber, how do we deal with the reputational risk that comes with what's covered and what's not covered?
I think that's a good challenge, but probably my response to that would be that, as I said earlier, we can use our expertise to do better at horizon scanning. We don't have perfect vision. New risks, such as cyber, if I go back to the origination of the industry's response to cyber risk, we had a very good data set of frequency in the US because data breaches were a matter of public record, but we had very little information as market participants who were involved on severity. So we did our best with catastrophe scenarios and aggregate management, and of course all the participants and market leaders like AIG and others have learned a lot as we've gone on, and they're going to apply that knowledge going forward. So I don't think we can pretend that we have perfect vision, particularly when we're dealing with new risk, and it would be wrong to do so. So I don't think we can be expected either to have perfect vision, but we can use expert judgment to innovate, allied with increasingly available better data sets and analytical tools.
Thank you. There's a myriad of questions here. I'm trying to flick through it. Rebecca, I'm not getting your messages coming through, I'm afraid. So I am working for the Q&A until we can find a different way of doing this. Another question, what do you consider to be the 3 top risks for the insurance sector? Brian, what do you consider to be the 3 top risks for the insurance sector?
Oh, geez. Why'd you give me that one, Stephen? I didn't want to get that first one, but I am so happy, you gave it to Neil. But now I take that one, and Neil, you do this one, okay? So, top risks. Wow. Okay. Well, it all depends how you put it, but I think in terms of what we take on, clearly cyber, I think is one that could cause us severe issues over time as the risk is evolving, and I do worry about that a lot. And I think if you stick along those lines, you point out the obvious, like this COVID issue and the like. But maybe number one on my list is climate and this, the ESG movement, which is a wonderful thing, but it's really pointing out, severe issues. And when you have these things, somebody has to be responsible, usually, and then that's where we come in because we're protecting that industry person, whatever. And so I think that evolving risk around ESG could be probably the most important and maybe existential threat to the industry.
Okay, anybody else got any views on that question? Because it's pretty topical.
Sure. I mean, intangible assets are now probably one of the biggest risks to companies, and identity fraud is another big challenge for people in addition to what Brian said. So climate, cyber are two on the top of everybody's. And I think people and talent is another probably top risk on a number of companies too.
Any other views, Julian or Neil? Look, well, there's one here which is absolutely gagging to be asked of you, Julian. Hard to make government listen. How can we collaborate?
I wish I'd taken you up and answered the first one, though. I think part of it, Stephen, is looking at the, we've spent a long time here looking at it through our lens, appropriately so. It's what we know best. But I think sometimes we have to look at it through their lens as well and answer some of these questions looking at it from their perspective, the policy perspective. Just talking about the British government, which is the bit I know best, and others can comment on other countries. But we are 300 billion into the British economy, with probably, goodness knows, another 100 billion to come. So the biggest event since the Second World War. How are we going to pay for that? And then you talk about the changing demographics that Brian and Vicky were just talking about, plus some others like aging population, health, wealth gap, supply chain interruption, et cetera, and then add on top of that the crystallization of another event, either a catastrophic cyber attack or a catastrophic terrorism event. And I wonder how you ever come back from that. And one of the questions here is, it's more cost effective to use the taxpayers' money than the insurance industry's money. Well, the taxpayers only got a certain amount of money before they all start leaving for other countries. And so I think I think we do have to look at it from the government's perspective. And you and I have discussed this and what that means in terms of how we design a public-private partnership that takes account of our need to protect our shareholders, but also their need to fulfill a policy objective and not bankrupt themselves in the process. And so, not an answer, Stephen, but it just kind of gives you that it's a multifaceted problem.
Yeah, it really is. That is absolutely right. Vicky, there's another question here which is crying out for you, particularly because of your interest in youth talent coming through the industry, which you've been working at for many years now. What do you think is the best way to ensure we as an industry attract talent with the skills required to tackle systemic risks? So what do you think is the best way to ensure we as an industry attract talent with the skills required to tackle systemic risk?
It's a great question. And I think, as an industry, we haven't exactly been exemplary at attracting talent in. And when we do attract them, I'm not sure we're very good at maintaining them. I think we've got to be much more focused at reaching out to broader circles of talent with very different skill sets. And I think one of the important things in the future is just identifying the skill sets that this industry will need. And I think those will be very different from what they have been in the past. So I think you will need, I think the poll was interesting to say, it was talking around modeling and credentials around modeling, and whether it's actuaries or data scientists. But I can see there'll be much more focus on that, projecting forward, looking at, future events rather than always looking in a rearview mirror. We need to look forward much more. So I think going out and attracting young people to come into this industry, it's the most amazing industry. We think everything that, life touches, this industry touches too. So it should be an extremely interesting business for them to come into. And I think the excitement is the way that risk is changing, and how we do need to attract different talents and different skill sets in to look at it in a completely different way. And I look at, just for example, the work going on in the innovation lab at Lloyd's, and some of the things coming out of there are fantastic. They're completely new, innovative ideas. They need to be challenged. They can be challenged. If they fail fast, but at least they're attempting to bring in new products. So I think it's up to us to be much more proactive in going out, showing the strengths, what a great industry it is, and attracting, as I say, totally different skill sets into the industry, and fishing further afield. And then making sure when they come in that we train them and we open them up to, some of the things that the challenges we threat, and let the younger generation come forward and put their ideas forward. Because I think there's an awful lot of stifling of this industry of some of the younger people who do have some tremendous ideas. And I see it within our organization. Some of the youngest, newest talent have got some of the best, most creative ideas. So let them come through, let them speak their minds, and let's listen to them.
Yeah, I'd add to that, Vicky, and I know you'd agree with this, that one of the real challenges we've got with the shutdown is actually developing that talent you're talking about, because they live off each other. They learn from us elders who maybe how not to do it rather than how to do it, who knows. But they are severely cut off at the moment. And I think one of the things we've got to do as an industry, as soon as it's practical when we open up, is to re-engage with the young people and get them thinking, and for us to listen to what they have to say. I think you're actually right. Some of the really best ideas do come from the youngsters, without any doubt at all.
And if we fish in the same pools, we get the same people. The success of a company is having people from every different type of pool, so you get a completely different sort of view aspect on a situation.
Okay, next question. I'm going to open this one up to everybody, actually. Can there be a pandemic risk pool formed by reinsurers in order to cope with future pandemics like contingencies? Can there be a pandemic risk pool formed by reinsurers in order to cope with future pandemic like contingencies? And I'd like to actually broaden that a bit, if I may. I hope the questioner won't mind, in saying, is it appropriate to have individual risk pools for individual systemic types of risk, or should we, as I suggested earlier on, pull them all together? Brian, can you start with that?
Yeah, well, okay, first of all, look, could you form a pool? Yeah, you can form a pool. It'll work. I'm not so sure. And what I I'm pretty strong in this belief. The issue we have is a pool appears to be pre-funded, okay? You put a pool of capital up or whatever, and I don't know how you pre-fund a risk that produces trillions in losses, okay? I particularly wonder how one does it now when we still got to pay for the current risk, okay? Where, the world's governments have effectively taken it on, because it is a risk of society, not the insurance industry. It's beyond anything we could do anyway. And so you have, who knows the size of the economic loss that's already been incurred, okay? So you say, okay, let's, you guys take care of that. Now we'll pre-fund the next one. And that means that I've got to somehow run the risk, because if I start charging you premiums now, it'll take me 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, pick a number of years in order to get something, close to what I need to cover the risk. In the meantime, what happens if something happens in 2, 3, 4, 5 years? So you say, I don't know how you do that. And you say, well, society, we'll just tax. We'll just put a tax on, and it won't be our balance sheet. We'll just be the conduit for the tax. You could do that. But I think it just gets back to the fact that the thing is too big. Now, so you say, okay, if it's too big, you can't pre-fund it, you post-fund it. Well, that's just taxing. That's where we are now. And so the answer to the other question is, sure, throw them all in, because you can't do one. Throw them all in and not do any of them. It doesn't make any sense to throw COVID and terrorism and who knows what else, the all risk pool that covers all things to all people at all times. I can't even say the words. So no, I don't believe you can do it.
Well, not much doubt about that. Neil, what do you think?
I think I preferred the start of Brian's response there, where I think I'd give an open mind to the question. Thinking back to the solution to the terrorism challenges that he and the industry faced into following 9/11, I think that's a pretty successful story in the end, because the insurance industry, for the statutory risks that it was carrying that Brian talked about, the insurance industry was challenged to keep performing its service to the US economy without the solution that was created. And I think what the public-private partnership that developed TRIA enabled the commercial market to grow into the space that was defined for it. And that I think that was a success for the insurance industry. So I think I'd be a bit more positive than Brian, that yes, we can tackle this problem. I'd agree with him on his last point. I think that picking up some of the points that were raised earlier about the need to be really clear about our product and the way it operates, and also the point that was raised about needing to be really clear when we speak to government about what it is that we need. I think that suggests to me that it'd be better if we focused on the pandemic issue, if that is the challenge that we're trying to tackle.
Vicky?
Probably slightly like-minded to Neil. I think there are ways that we can help. I just don't believe that we can cover everything on all fronts. So, same as Brian, I think it's just too big, and some of the issues. And COVID's been a massive challenge. I hate to think what sort of cyber event could be as well. It could be even bigger. We just don't know. And then what else is there out there that we haven't even thought of? Which is what worries me, and how on earth do we prepare for something like that? But it still, to me, comes back to our industry can create products which can help to a certain extent. And I think, we will create more products, and I think we will get better at creating different types of products, but they will have restrictions. And as I say, it will limit the amount of cover people can buy from the industry, and the rest will have to fall back to governments. So, you do look at the parametrics, and, which can give some temporary relief in certain respects. And there's, a number of initiatives around the world which have been done and are being done at the moment around that, but it won't pick up everything. So it has to be, a private-public partnership.
Julian, I'm going to give you the last word, if I may. I mean, you've been grappling with these issues almost non-stop for the last 12 months. And you and I have talked about it on many occasions. So give us the benefit of your views, what you've learned, and what you've heard today from fellow panelists, if you would.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'm really glad you asked Vicky and Neil to go first, because I did not want to be the one that disagreed with Brian Dupereau. Look, there's a lot of, obviously he's right on many, many fronts. the problem is I think on any of these perils, we have to start somewhere. And there are a lot of things that we do well as an industry that we should share with the customer and with government, not least of which is a fantastic claims-paying mechanism that even if we carried 0% of the risk, putting that at the disposal of the government so they had an alternative to just filing money through the banking system has to be something that's worthwhile. The other thing is, of course, if these are, regular events, then I don't think a pooling solution is a possibility. But if you're talking about events that happen very, very rarely, and you're talking about the tail piece of the event is accepted by government as staying with them, then there must be a design that we can produce to add some value into this process. And in order to do that, there has to be a profit opportunity for us. The government has to understand that we have to protect our shareholders from insolvency, and we want to make a profit in the process of doing so. And we have to understand what the government's policy objectives are as well. And there has to be that partnership and that compromise in the design of what we do. So as you and I have discussed many times, I believe we should play a part. It's a question of how we design the part and what part the government is willing to play in response.
Stephen, can I just say something? Because, yes, I was a little negative in my response, I have to admit. Look, we clearly have to be, good citizens and therefore have to help. And when, people are in need, you come forward with what you can do. And so I'm not saying that we should not work with the government to try and work things so that we can apply our expertise to help society. What I fear is it turns into we can do something we can't do. And that's what I fear. I really fear. And, putting solutions up that don't work. And we are, as an industry, everybody was right out of the blocks. My brokerage friends, had their solutions. We as the insurance companies said, no, you will take that, you do that. So then we have, but we're all scrambling around, coming up with answers to the question in an event that was going on. It was actively, creating risk as we spoke. So I want to be clear that we need to work. There's no question with the government. We have to be corporate citizens, but we have to be very, very careful not to represent ourselves as a solution to a problem we can't solve, certainly can't solve alone. And that's what I really worry about. And a lot of times we're just, in a way, to be politically correct, misrepresenting ourselves.
Brian, thank you for that. I actually completely agree with you. I think there is a duty of care for us within the industry not to overpromise and underdeliver. We should underpromise and overdeliver, without doubt. Maybe our Prime Minister might learn that sometime, who knows. But I think your point is well made, and I have this fear that we've got to stay within the art of the doable. Well, sadly, we've come to the end of the hour and a half allotted to us. I'd like to thank the audience for being there and participating and for your questions. I hope that you've gleaned something from this debate. I hope it leaves you with the desire to strive for new sustainable solutions and the desire to protect the society in which we live, particularly against systemic risk. And lastly, I have to thank the organisers, and not least of which, of course, my fellow panellists, whose contribution has been invaluable. With that, I'd like to say goodbye, and thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.